Diablo 4 Season 14 has just about come to an end, and personally I think it might have actually been the worst season ever. I know that sounds like a hot take, maybe you agree, maybe you don't. Let's chat about it. So, Season 14 came hot on the heels of Lord of Hatred, Mephisto's defeat. That was the last season we had, which was incredible. It had its downfalls, but it was pretty good. One of the best ones, and it was something we all needed. But Season 14 came around, and it was called Death Awakening. And Death Awakening came with this new variety of mechanics that allowed you to upgrade normal unique items to mythic items, and these were done. This was done via Pandemonium fragments, which could be farmed using a method of fighting the new boss, I believe the Corrupted Reaper. And along with this was dynamic sort of world events, I believe a sort of recycled mechanic from a few seasons back, where you had to stand in a larger circle. Once the large circle opened up, a variety of smaller circles opened up in the big circle, and you stood in the small circle to stop the big circle from closing. Yeah, this season's been nicknamed the Season of Circles for a very good reason. The season came with a few other changes, such as solo self-found, finally, and also death toll chambers, which to this day still don't seem to add a massive benefit. So the new boss, Corrupted Reaper, you needed superior keys, layer keys, to open their chest, and one of the only ways you could get those was through death toll chambers. And this proved difficult because getting a death toll chamber to pop was quite difficult. It wasn't really in your control. That's since been changed, but when it first came out, that was one of the major sort of flaws of the season. On paper, Season 14 sounded pretty sweet, you know, if you think about it. We got this idea of this overhauled mythic system, something we didn't necessarily ask for, but being told with a giant asterisk next to it that you could upgrade items to mythic and that you could have a build sort of massively focused on purple gear. It was quite massive, it was quite huge, especially for a lot of those endgame players. And all the different things that they had promised sounded good on paper, but like I say, there was a giant asterisk next to a variety of those things that we didn't then learn about until the season dropped. But it's important to note, before I start criticising it, you know, I need to make it clear, Diablo 4 is a good game. I know that's seen as a hot take a lot of the times these days, but I think it's a good game. It's had its moments, but it's probably in the best state of its life, given the way it started back in 2023. I mean, if you have played since then and you're looking back, the variety of things we've had since then have been massive. You know, the game's came an awful long way. But anyway, the season mechanic of this game, as mentioned earlier, was these circles. And one of the ironic things that I think about when I talk about this season to people, especially those who have been around for all of the seasons, will be familiar with a period in which Diablo decided to remove doors inside dungeons because they felt like it was slowing down players. It felt like it was hindering the flow, especially with builds like the dash rogue and things like that. The builds that move fast were being punished because of dungeon doors. Really, really small quality of life, but something they ended up removing doors just to make that flow a little bit better. The ironic thing now is we're in this season where the complete opposite seems to be the main focus, and slowing down, taking your time, seems to be the new thing. And with that being said, it seems very backwards in the way that they've conducted this season. I don't know what went into the decision making. I would love to have been a fly on the wall. And we've now essentially been told, stand in this circle, the circle will get large, lots of small circles will appear, stand in them, and every time you stand in them, enemies will spawn. Kill the enemies, the circle will remain large, and it will keep shrinking as you're doing this. The more enemies you kill, the less the larger circle shrinks. And ultimately, at the very end of that, you have a chance of a boss spawning, allowing you to go into a death toll chamber. And it seems very counterintuitive when we've just had a quality of life removing doors to speed up pace, but yet here we are slowing down. Seems a wee bit bizarre if you ask me. Now, the feature that I think I was most excited about was the mythics. We were obviously explained through campfires and things that you would have the ability to equip more than one mythic maybe this wasn't super clear at the beginning, but you had a variety of mythics that you could use. So obviously a lot of endgame builds still used unique pieces of gear. Then you had your mythics such as Shaco and Shroud of False Death, Ring of Starless, etc. Or last season, one of the most powerful mythics was Melted Heart of Selig for the Immortal Barb. Shout out Rob. And those mythics that we all know and love were renamed iconic mythics and sort of got pushed a little bit to the bottom of the pool of these new ones that had came into the game. This sounded really, really good because it sounded like there would be more build variety, you would be more powerful. You know, they've made a strong amount of controversial choices in the past, but most of the time they've balanced it out. And in this case, it was a case of the strong argument was you could only equip one crafted mythic, but you could equip multiple if they just randomly dropped. But therein lies the problem. The drop rate for mythics of this season was pretty awful. I remember last season, Lord of Hatred, I think I had like 2, maybe 3 stash pages full of mythics within the first 2 weeks. Now some people might say that's a problem, and that it's just saturated and too bad, and others might say that's a good balance. The greater issue is you're never going to please everyone, but one thing I think we can probably all agree on, this particular season for drop rates of mythics was diabolical, so much so that they had to release an emergency patch, or so they say, because they released it a week after they announced it, so not very emergency, but yeah. However, you could still use a lot of mythics, and this did absolutely promise more power and make you a little bit stronger. But anyone who's familiar with the endgame of Diablo 4 knows that most players follow the same route. Towards the end of the game, you know, you've got your build on your screen, whether that's on Mobilitics, Icy Veins, D4 builds, wherever you go, there's usually a variety, whether it be your starter and leveling to your mid to end, and then your full end, maybe pit push, depends. And in those builds you can see that you usually need to get some kind of, at the time, mythic, now known as an iconic mythic, to really push that build. So for me personally, in all my time, and I'd love to hear everyone else's, you know, processes for this, would always be, you would follow your seasonal journey. Usually by the end you would get a Resplendent Spark. Perfect. And you'd maybe go and fight Lilith and maybe get another spark. That's 2. You really only needed 2. You would then hop over at the jeweler and craft whatever one you needed. But of course you'd need runes. That in itself was a problem, but it was fairly simple to address with the Undercity and things like that. That then allowed you to sort of create the final version of your build. That process took a slightly different form in the newer season. Those mythics were no longer target craftable. You couldn't just go to the jeweler and pop your runes in and anything like that and get the exact one you needed. You could craft a ring, a mythic ring, a mythic helmet, so on and so forth, but it would never be able to target explicitly what you need. And if your build fundamentally required one of those iconic mythics, the only way you could do that was blacksmith. And you could craft a mythic cache for 50 million gold and 2 sparks. And this meant that you had one small avenue of still targeting iconic mythics. And again, this presented problems because you couldn't pick exactly what you'd want. You'd have maybe 100 million gold to your hand if you had just started the game, you know, just started that end game grind. You had maybe 150 million gold after you've spent a variety of it tempering and blah blah blah, and you put in to get a mythic cache and it spits out a Shattered Vow or an Andariel's Visage. Completely pointless, and it puts you back to square one. Well, that was an issue, and to this day that's still not massively been addressed. One thing that was always noted was those mythics had a tag on the bottom of them called crafted. So as soon as you crafted that mythic, it would have a tag on it, a bit like, you know, unmodifiable or account bound sort of thing like that. And it meant that mythic was crafted, and the rule of the new season was you could only have one crafted mythic, whether that be something that you got from the jeweler or something that you got from the blacksmith. Either or, it was one or the other. And that meant you could only have one of those equipped. So if, for example, you played the Barbarian and you decided to craft a Grandfather, but you needed a Melted Heart, you could craft them both. You couldn't equip them both. You can only pick one. And that was a problem. Thankfully, now, as of at least the 27th of July, that's issue's been fixed, at least for a few days now, thankfully. Now, on to the more glaring issue that I think really bothered a lot of people. This new mechanic of upgrading to Mythic was a classic case of read before you click, I guess you could say. It was always sort of alluded that you could put in a piece of gear and upgrade it to have Mythic quality, go from unique to purple, increase its affixes, etc, etc. That was how it was almost pegged to everyone, me included. And so me, probably a lot like everyone else who might have made this mistake, spent an awful lot of time in resources and things like that crafting the best piece of gear. You know, thanks to the Heraldric Cube, you had a lot more flexibility with the different types of aspects you could add to a piece of equipment. You know, you could add vulnerability multipliers, crit strike damage multipliers. Obviously you couldn't specifically pick which one, but it still allowed you to have a lot more freedom over which pieces of gear and how they worked. Now, me personally, I had thought that this meant that you had this final piece of gear, this 3 or 4 GA greater affix piece of equipment that you've crafted and spent all your time on. You've then went and fought the Corrupted Reaper and got yourself 5 Pandemonium fragments, which is the exact amount you need to upgrade it to Mythic in the cube. You then go to Temis, you pop your item into the cube, and you think this is going to spit out a Mythic, this is going to be amazing. No. So I made the mistake many a times with my Stormclaw Druid from this season and put in things like my Totem or my Malefic Crescent and thought that I was going to get a Mythic variant of that in return, but in actual fact I would get a random amulet or a random totem. I wouldn't get the exact item back, and the chances of getting that item back was random. And this was pretty clear if you read the tooltip, but because the season and the developers and the way everything was conducted, it sort of read that this was a case of pop your item and upgrade it to Mythic. Everyone knows we've all got different journeys in terms of your piece of gear. You find your piece of gear, it's perfect, then you know the journey that everyone follows. Usually, you know, remove or add an affix, add your sockets, add your temples, re-roll any of the affixes that you don't like at the enchanter, then masterwork, get it to the way you want it. That would usually be the end of the line for your piece of gear. Maybe then you could transfigure it as well. That was always a gamble, but that's a different story. This season that changed. There was an extra step, and that was upgrading it to Mythic. So you'd done all of the previous, and then you'd put it in with its 4 greater affixes that you've finally managed to roll god tier piece of equipment, maybe even 5, and it spits out a non-GA purple piece of gear that was completely useless. That was a different level of pain, and like I say, part of it's on the players, us, because often if you had read the tooltip it would make sense, but I had made the mistake sometimes of popping it in, especially early game, and realising that it didn't work the way I was expecting it to. Now thankfully we've all moaned enough, whether it be on the forums, in the game, on Discord, on YouTube. Everyone's made enough noise that they've finally released patches that changes a lot of the things that I've mentioned in this video. Like the crafted tag is finally gone, so you can have more than one piece of gear of Mythic quality. The iconic drop rate for the iconic Mythics has increased a little bit, so you can target farm them a little bit more. I still think they're pretty poor. I don't think they're, at least not to the level they were previously, but with the introduction of all these new ones, that's never really going to be that case anyway. And I think they've reduced the amount of Pandemonium fragments you need from 5 to 4. Not a great deal, but still an extra. You know, after 5 runs, for example, that's maybe an extra saving you've made. So it's still a little bit of a help. They did come out and they did explain that a lot of these updates that they bring out and things are a bit of a lesson to them, that sometimes things don't land properly, and that's respectable. We've had so many amazing things come to Diablo over the last 2 years, 3 years, that they've ultimately put in for a season and then removed them, which is incredibly unfortunate. But we have seen a return of a lot of those things. Transfiguration in the cube essentially was just a copy and paste of Sanctification from one of the previous seasons. A great mechanic, really really good, but unfortunately there's such a saturation in terms of what you can get on your gear that it's never really worth the payoff. You know, it's quite rare, but nonetheless I think a lot of those reasons is why I personally would think this particular season of Diablo has a bit hit and a miss. Now I've still played it. I have for the first time in my life. or the first time in Diablo 4's lifespan with me, uninstalled the game twice, but it's got me in a claw grip. I keep coming back, but then I keep realising why I keep leaving, so it's a bit frustrating. We can only hope that the new season coming out is going to be good. I believe they've made statements to say that the upgrade to Mythic mechanic is going to be staying, it's going to be improving as the new season drops in Season 15, when this final one runs its course. So I think it's always safe to expect that after a massive expansion like Vessel of Hatred or Lord of Hatred, you're going to have a bit of a sort of calm, slower paced season, just because your expectations are through the roof. You've maybe had the best season, the best experience, nothing's going to compare. So you've got to sort of lower your expectations a little bit, but I think this season has been well and truly received pretty poorly, and the numbers on things like SteamDB and things show that. You know, the community's made it known that they're not happy with this season at all, and it's sad that it's came to that, but unfortunately that's just the way things are. But as I say, fingers crossed the next season is going to be good. You can leave a comment and let me know what you think of this season, what your gripes have been, and hopefully, fingers crossed, we cross paths again in Season 15, and we'll keep an eye out and see what sort of news we get. I'll be sure to make some sort of video and things talking about it as it runs up to the course of it coming out, and see what kind of things we can get excited about and what mistakes we can avoid making that we may have made this season running. Also guys, this is my first video on this topic, and I would appreciate any feedback. It goes a massively long way. This is an entirely new field for me. I would love some feedback. I would love some people to tell me that this is rubbish, what they think I could do differently, what I could do better. Your feedback makes things so much easier for me. I'm new to this, I'm no expert, I'm going to learn, but if you stick by me, we'll make some good content. There'll be some good things coming in the future. So, as I say, we'll catch up again soon. Fingers crossed the new season's good. For the remainder of Season 14, try and enjoy it. Have a bit of fun. The game is still good, there is still things there to enjoy, and I will catch you all in Season 15. Alright, ciao!